Hello, everyone. My name is Will Espericueta Luna, and I had just recently graduated with my PhD from the University of Florida, Department of Psychology, within the behavior analysis area. So, my specialty that I've spent the last 5 years or so studying is organizational behavior management. And first off, I'd like to apologize for not being able to present this presentation in person, but unfortunately, I got a new full-time position that's related to OBM that requires me to travel a lot. So unfortunately, I am probably on the plane on my way back at the time that you're watching this video. And so to frame a little bit of my background and take you on this journey about what OBM is, let's start off with a little bit of background information about me. I'm originally from Houston, Texas. And within Houston, Texas, it is really known for a lot of oil and gas industries, as well as a lot of manufacturing. So growing up, I spent a lot of time, driving through the city, seeing many people across all walks of life going to work every day. And this really left a mark on me because I realized just how much work is part of everyone's lives. So a little bit about my background. So I got my Bachelor's of Science degree in Applied Behavior Analysis back in 2017 from the University of North Texas. And I loved my experience there so much that I decided to stick around for a couple more years to do my master's degree in behavior analysis, in which I graduated back in 2021. From there, I came to the University of Florida because I really wanted to dive deep into organizational behavior management. And again, like I said a little earlier, I literally just defended my dissertation a couple of weeks ago, and so have finally wrapped up that part of my life. And so one of the things that I like to share right off the bat, and I usually do this in most presentations that involve behavior analysis, it's important for us to start at the core of what behavior analysis is. And so the core is this phrase right here, which is called radical behaviorism. So radical behaviorism, which you may have heard of in your other behavior analysis classes, is the philosophy of science behind behavior analysis as a field. And so one of my favorite quotes by Ed Malagotti back in 1986, I feel like beautifully exemplifies how we as behavior analysts and OBM researchers at practitioners use behavior analysis within our domain of applying the principles of behavior in real work settings. So Ed Malagotti said that radical behaviorism is a thoroughgoing worldview that integrates scientific philosophy and behavior principles into an epistemological, consistent general theory of human behavior. Basically, that's a long way of saying that radical behaviorism is the frame with which we use to see the world of behavior. This paper is great. If you have not read it, I highly recommend it. But Ed Malagotti basically says that any behavioral phenomenon is within the purview of a science of behavior. In other words, if we are interested in behavior across any kind of setting, whether it's clinical work with individuals with disabilities, organizational behavior management, education, no matter the context, the behavioral principles and philosophy stays the same and can be adapted to each one of these contexts. And so it really is like you're putting on a pair of glasses and you're using it to see the world a little differently. So the average person spends about 90,000 hours of their lifetime at work, which kind of exemplifies the importance of making the workplace better for everyone, which kind of goes back to the title of my presentation, Why Going to Work Doesn't Have to Suck. So have any of you guys ever had an experience at a job that you might have, or have seen people at jobs or maybe on shows where it kind of looks like this image on the left, where you have a manager screaming at their employee to get work done? However, We've also probably seen instances where a leader is able to work with their employees and create a safe, nurturing environment for everyone on the team. So I had a question for you guys that I want you to think about. Have you ever had a job that you enjoyed? Why is that? Have you ever had a job that you did not enjoy? And why is that? So back in the early 1960s, right here on the right, you'll see an image of B.F. Skinner, which is the founder of behavior analysis. Um, he developed, again, a whole comprehensive system of behavior that we could use to understand behavioral phenomena. And around the 1960s, we went from experimental work to a little bit more applied work across a variety of settings. So fundamentally, OBM, big picture, is a part of behavior analysis, right? Whenever we think about the field of behavior analysis, we have subcategories. We have the conceptual understanding of behavior analysis, we have the applied behavior analysis branch, and we also have the experimental analysis of behavior. So OBM is a sub-branch of the applied behavior analysis sub-umbrella in behavior analysis. The core idea in behavior analysis, as you may already know, is the analysis of environment-behavior relations. So whenever we're talking about organizational behavior management specifically, we're talking about the application of the behavioral principles to individuals or groups in businesses, industry, government, or health and human service settings. Overall, the goal in organizational behavior management is to try to create the best workplace for people to get the best out of people that are at their jobs. Overall, what we're trying to do is we're trying to focus on improving performance at work using behavior analysis in a way that is not only beneficial for the organization, but also beneficial for the employee themselves, right? Because we don't want to create a situation where we're making the employee's life worse. So within behavior analysis, organizational behavior management specifically, there are a variety of different types of interventions that can be used to change behavior. And they're kind of broadly categorized under these two umbrellas, antecedent-based interventions and consequence-based interventions. So these are kind of getting at the three-term contingency, right? Which is our fundamental unit of analysis. With consequence-based interventions, just like it implies, we're changing either the reinforcers of the behavior in order to try to increase the likelihood of behavior reoccurring in the future. However, we also have antecedent-based interventions in which we're trying to change the environment to set the occasion for a response to be more likely to occur. So an example of antecedent-based interventions include goal setting, which is one in which the person that is designing the behavior change program is systematically adjusting criterion based on performance to try to get it to a certain threshold. There's different kinds of training procedures like behavioral skills training, which are methodologically rigorous ways of developing trainings. There's task clarification, right? Different methods of trying to make sure that the worker understands the tasks that are at hand. And we also have prompts and reminders, right? It might be the case that the worker simply does not remember, loosely speaking, what behavior is required of them. So prompts and reminders are useful in this case. Now, an example of a consequence-based intervention, feedback is probably the most prevalent in the scientific literature and probably the most one applied across industries, which involves, again, the provision of information about performance to workers. There's also scorecards, which are a systematic way of designing a performance criteria. So it's similar to goal setting, where you physically, or I guess literally outline expectations and provide a score to workers depending on their performance. So usually imagine it's like a literal card with different sets of behaviors across a different number of levels. And so it's kind of like a report card, I guess, in in an organizational setting. And so these have been commonly used to try to provide feedback to workers and improve their performance. There's also different ways to arrange reinforcement contingencies, such as incentives, right? We'll put certain kinds of monetary incentives or other kinds of incentives to try to motivate, loosely speaking, behavior to occur. But again, motivation is not the word we use here, but to reinforce specific responses that we would like to see again. And so within behavior analysis, there are a different variety of sub-branches even within the organizational behavior management umbrella. So generally, these are categorized across 3 levels. We have performance management, systems analysis, and behavior-based safety. So I will talk about each one in turn. So performance management is the application of behavioral principles to manage the performance of employees. So for example, in this paper by Cunningham and Austin back in 2007, their aim was to try to increase the use of a hands-free technique during a surgical procedure. And so basically the idea was that they wanted surgeons to not pass the tools directly to the person next to them. The reason is that they observed a lot of injuries to their assistants because of this process. So as you can imagine, if I passed you a knife directly on the side of me, if I'm not paying attention, I could potentially get cut. So they found that a more recommended practice was to instead put the tool in the middle of the tray and have the other individual pick up that tool, right? Thereby making it less likely that the person injures themselves from a cut. And so they created an intervention package, which again included task clarification, where they basically outlined to the surgeons what the proper procedure of that hands-free technique was. They also set goals in terms of how frequently they wanted the surgeons to use this technique and systematically increase the criterion over time. And then they also provided feedback. So they informed the surgeons about how their performance was ranking based on the goals that were set, right? So ideally, we would want to see an increase in the use of this hands-free technique. So these were the results. On the x-axis, we have the session number. On the y-axis, we have the percentage of chart exchanges using the neutral zone. And so this is an example of a multiple baseline design across settings. And so we see during baseline, the use of the the hands-free technique was low, but once the goal setting feedback and task clarification and peer prompting intervention was implemented, we see readily an increase in the usage of this new technique. And then the researchers came back a while later to see if the performance maintained, and they saw that the maintenance data suggests that this technique continued to be used even after the intervention was withdrawn. So now, a different sub-branch within the field of organizational behavior management is known as behavioral systems analysis. So basically what BSA is, it's a top-down process improvement methodology, which involves the analysis and modification of organizational processes to try to produce the greatest amounts of improvement in organization. And so here on the image to my right, you'll see that the steps that are taken to try to understand the different levels of the organization, going from big picture and narrowing it down in order to try to further understand the connection across all these levels and try to find any inconsistencies that could be corrected at each level. So I actually came from a lab during my master's degree where we heavily used this behavioral systems analysis approach. So this poster that I presented at ABAI many years ago kind of exemplifies the approach that we took. So basically, we at the time were consulting with an academic administration department within a university. And so we followed the methodology in order to try to, again, find gaps in their systems and try to improve them. So we started out big picture, and then we narrowed down level by level, again, going from the macro system to the organization, processes, tasks, etc., in order to try to pinpoint all these different areas where those discrepancies existed so we could correct them. Ultimately, what the approach looks like, you end up creating a lot of diagrams that kinds of represents the process and allows you to more closely analyze these procedures and processes. So this is an example of one of the process maps that we created. And this one is called a cross-functional process map. So here it's also known as a swim lane map. So you'll see that each different swim lane has the outline of a person. So for example, the top one is a student, the second one is an advisor, and then at the bottom you see information technology. And so this diagram basically allows you to see the different points in a process, again, allowing you to get a better understanding of what the process looks like in reality and trying to find gaps where those processes can be improved. And one thing to note is that even though I kind of talked about organizational behavior management as having those three distinct umbrellas: performance management, behavioral systems analysis, and behavioral safety, or behavioral systems analysis, you'll realize that they're not mutually exclusive, right? Great OBM approaches use both. So for example, my advisor, actually, Dr. Nicole Gravina, and one of her former students back in 2018 published a paper where they combined both performance management with behavioral systems analysis to try to improve the average door to discharge time in an emergency department by reducing the average door to order. Basically, what happened in this study is that they were consulting with a hospital that was basically having their patients spending way too much time at the hospital. This hospital was basically losing a lot of money, and the patients were, I guess, suffering because they could not get in and out a lot faster. And so both Dr. Gravina and her student completed process mapping, which is like what I just showed you, where they diagrammed the process to try to identify strengths and weaknesses and provide recommendations to the company. And they also provided daily feedback. So once they understood the processes and made systematic changes, they saw that the improvement wasn't as steadfast as they would have hoped by just simply changing the system. So then they incorporated a feedback component, and these were the results. On the x-axis, you have the time in months. On the y-axis, on the left, you see the average number of minutes. And on the y-axis, you see on the right y-axis, you see the average number of minutes as well. The gray bars are door to the first lab times, and then the black squares are the door to discharge times. So basically, what you see across baseline is that both the time to get those labs done and the time it took for a patient to come in and come out of the hospital was really high. Once they implemented the process change using the behavioral systems methodology, you see a decrease in both the door to first lab time as well as the door to discharge time. However, you see that there was still some room for improvement, so they incorporated a daily feedback intervention, and they saw that they were able to further decrease those door to first lab times as well as the doors to discharge times. Overall, showing that both behavioral systems analysis combined with performance management can create greater improvements than either of them alone. Finally, the last area within organizational behavior management is known as behavioral safety. So more specifically, this is the analysis and modification of work environments to reduce injuries and promote safe behavior of employees. So this is actually the area where I'm working at now. And so basically, one thing that you guys may already know is that the workplace could be very, very dangerous, right? Like you see in this image on the right, you see workers are exposed to risks and hazard that could potentially injure them and give them severe injuries. or it could lead to death in the worst of cases. So behavioral safety tries to aim to reduce the likelihood that these injuries or even death occurs. So one specific technique within behavioral safety is called behavior-based safety. So basically, it is a process in which you develop a peer-to-peer observation and feedback system. So coworkers basically go out, conduct observations over each other, and using a checklist, mark whether the colleague is using safe practices or at-risk practices. And so basically, this process is meant to, again, try to provide feedback to workers at the point at which work occurs. So the intervention, again, includes various components. So for example, it generally starts with conducting something called a historical assessment, which is a way to try to analyze the injury data for the business and try to pinpoint what the different behaviors that workers engage in are posing the most risk to the workers. After that, again, they base those identified behaviors and create a safety observation and feedback system using a checklist. And then after that, they create a goal of how many percent of safe observations they want to see. So basically, the idea is to try to get workers involved, conducting observations and providing feedback as much as possible. And then finally, there's generally some kind of reward mechanism for making improvements in terms of the percentage of safety observations and feedback that is provided to workers. So overall, this is an example of what these data could look like or do look like. So this is a study that was conducted many years ago in which on the x-axis, you see the years, and on the y-axis, you see the number of recordable incidents per 200,000 work hours, which is basically a standard way of showing how often injuries are occurring. So ideally, we want to see the numbers decrease. And in this study, they actually used a behavior-based safety program at I want to say it was a mining, actually, no, it was an oil refinery. So it was in the oil and gas industry, which again, like I told you, can be a very dangerous place. So across time, you see that before the intervention occurred, you see a decreasing trend. However, it's important to note, because you might be sophisticated researchers out there, I know you guys are, and you might be concerned. Okay, so how can we make judgments based on that decreasing trend? Well, in the world of safety, it's actually pretty common for an organization to kind of already make changes to try to improve their safety before they contact a behavior-based safety expert. And the reason is because they can make improvements that protect workers, but it can only produce so much improvement, right? Eventually, it's going to hit a floor and won't be able to improve much further. As you can see here, those last two data points in the baseline are flat. So then they implement a behavioral safety intervention across a couple of years, and you see that it takes a little bit of time for them to see significant improvements beyond those that were obtained with during the baseline phase. But again, because behavior-based safety is generally a pretty thorough and process that has a lot of moving parts that's difficult to nail down. But once they nailed it, right, as you can see, years after 1999, you see the recordable injury rates start to substantially decrease beyond those results that were obtained at the beginning of the behavior-based safety intervention. And you also see those improvements maintained over time. So I hope this presentation provided you with a pretty good overarching idea of what OBM is and all the things within organizational management that you can learn either from the performance management side, behavioral systems analysis side, or the behavioral safety side. So if you are interested in a potential career in organizational behavior management, my advisor and some of her colleagues actually published a paper not too long ago where they actually outlined what the process of getting a career in organizational behavior management looks like. So I highly recommend you check out this paper if you want to explore more about what careers in organizational behavior management look like. So if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. You can either get my contact information through your professor, Janae Pendergrass, or can email me directly at wespercuitaluna@ufo.edu. So I hope this was informative, and best of luck in your future endeavors, and hopefully some of you become my colleagues in organizational behavior management. Thank you.